hidden in plain sight.
Hello, and welcome back to Hidden in Plain Sight, the series that dares to ask, what if Christopher Marlowe did not die in Deptford in 1593? I'm Dr. Julian, your host for Season 4, The Search for the Rival Poet, and with me is our regular co-host, Carol Paxton. Welcome back, Carol.
Hello, Julian.
Carol, we are switching up the format once again. In the next few episodes, we will be witnessing a new conversation between Professor Joseph Khoury and our friend Dr. Peter Hodges, the author of Marlowe's Complaint and the inspiration for this series. If you remember, we first met Dr. Khoury in the final episode of Season 3. We had hoped to feature questions from Dr. Rachel Wyfall's students, but we did not manage to coordinate times for all parties concerned. That said, Dr. Khoury enjoyed being part of the program so much that he accepted our invitation to pursue a person-to-person conversation. As you know, he is the chairperson of the Department of English at St Francis Xavier University at Antigonish, Nova Scotia, Canada. And as you can imagine, with his job title, he has so many responsibilities that we had to work around his schedule. So he and Peter recorded their discussions separately. For this series, you and I, Carol, will introduce these sessions and comment on them as we go. Is that fine with you?
Yes, sounds like a good idea. Peter won't be with us then.
Well, he's already in the discussions that we will be watching and lurking in the background. We can't give him all the limelight, can we? Besides, he has quite a lot to say in the videos already. So it's up to us to give our thoughts and comments.
Right, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Yes, could be fun, yes.
Great. So let's have a quick recap. In Season 3, we looked at the first 17 sonnets, also known as the Procreation Sonnets, in the collection of sonnets known as Shakespeare's Sonnets, first published in 1609. In this series, we will return to the sonnets. However, this time we will look at the sonnets numbered 78 to 86, more popularly known as the Rival Poet Sonnets. Peter and Professor Khoury will investigate if it's possible to determine the identity of the so-called rival poet solely from the information contained in those famous sonnets. Longtime followers of the show will know that Peter and I have already explored this question extensively in Season 1. So if that's not a good reason for you to go back and revise what you've heard or to listen to it again if you've not heard it at all, this is a great opportunity. However, this time around, it's another wonderful opportunity for us to re-explore this question with an independent academic scholar who leads a team of educators dedicated to the appreciation and command of English and who teaches students of his own. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty excited because I believe it's the first time this has ever been attempted. So if you're ready, Carol, let's listen in on Peter and Joseph's conversation.
Yeah, roll it, as they say in Hollywood, or perhaps not.
The way that I've tried to treat this question, I think, is a little different from the way that most of the, I want to say, scholars who tackle it approach it.
Right.
My impression is that most of them go in for a literary type of criticism in order to find, you know, the usual characteristics of what an author proposed is proposed to be, and then they try to match that up with what they find in the poems and so forth. And I think that that's, generally speaking, I think that they're taking a reverse course. They have in their mind who they think it could be, and then they look for the evidence that supports the conclusion.
Okay.
I want to look at this as a crime scene.
Right.
I want to look at this as I'm walking into a room and I don't have anything in mind other than what I can discern from the crime scene.
Okay.
So I have to take what is said to me, either by evidence that's on the floor, blood, or a knife, or evidence that is in an eyewitness statement, or in some other statement, such as a group of poems that happens to address this room and its contents.
Right.
Okay. So you're good with that premise. I mean, the premise is,
Yeah, look, I mean, you have a theory and you want to try to, make the argument. That's fine. I guess where I may suggest a potential, differentiation, I guess, maybe, but is, we have limited evidence just by virtue of the fact that, this is Elizabethan England. They didn't have, storage capacity or that kind of thing. They didn't, have the vast printing resources or any of that stuff, right? And then, of course, there was a lot of secrecy as well. It was the monarch and everyone else, essentially. So, so when it comes to the poetry, in any form, be it a sonnet or a sequence or a play, we also have to rely on those references and what people say about them, and that's important, because that's sort of, it's indirect, but the evidence may be indirect, but it's nonetheless, suggestive, if not sometimes conclusive, sometimes not, so I think it's important to try to maintain the references to the poetry at the same level as other pieces of evidence, I guess is what I'm saying.
all right, but you would accept that we're only going to utilize references that actually address those poems. We're not going to try and pull things from sources that don't address those poems or that don't address those people. I mean, it's in the nature of things that I'm interested in. If somebody makes a comment in a poem about another person, I'm going to try to take that comment and line it up with what other people have said about that person.
Right.
And if it's a comment that pertains to his personal character or something that he or she has written, I'm going to try to determine whether or not, in fact, he had that observed characteristic, such as the color of his hair, or that he indeed did write the words that he's alleged to have written.
Yeah. So let me give you an example of, what I would think would be strong evidence, and some that may be suggestive evidence, but it's not conclusive. So, for example, Miri's references to Shakespeare's plays or sonnets is pretty strong evidence, and fairly conclusive. A suggestive piece of evidence where there's an allusion, like, for example, that the poet may be Marlowe in some of the sonnets of Shakespeare, that Richard Levin makes the argument. It's not conclusive, but it's suggestive, so, that could be debated, right? So if you have a diary entry, for example, where a poet is named and tied to a particular work of art, that's pretty good evidence, Obviously, stationer's register is pretty good evidence. It doesn't mean that it's not, they can't make mistakes, but it's pretty good evidence,
Okay, well, I don't have a problem with any of that.
Yeah.
Now, what I would like to suggest, or to try to dig through, is the rival poet sequence,
Mm-hmm.
and pull out statements that describe the rival,
Mm-hmm.
and apply that. Figure out how many statements I have, first of all, that I can, and a priori, I'm going to assume that all of these statements are true.
Right.
I'm going to assume that the person who is trying to describe his rival is not trying to mislead you or me.
Okay.
He may be unwilling to name that person for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
It might be poetic reasons. It might be, danger to his own person if he was to actually name him. But he chooses not to name him at the same time that he is providing us with information about him.
Okay.
Okay, some level of information. And, to just jump ahead and short circuit the process a little bit, there are 5 things that I've found that I think are sufficient to be considered statements about this individual, either what he did or when he did it, and that these 5 statements give me enough to work with that I can eliminate all others as suspects.
Okay.
Now, the first question you have to ask is, who could be a suspect?
Right.
I mean, when you read the whole thing, you realize we're dealing with a rival poet. It is a poet because he refers to his verses and he refers to his poetry. And so we can dispose of a lot of other people who are simply not poets. And so then we try to figure out which of these guys, based on the identifying things that are said, could be a candidate. And the first, not the first thing that's said, but it seems to me the first test we can ask is there's a line, and I'm not going to quote it because I don't have it in front of me. But if we use this as a platform, I'll flash it up, I'll put it in a, but there's a line where the author of the sonnet says, in others' poems, you make a few corrections, but to me, you are my motivating muse.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what do we take from that? Well, on the one hand, he's criticizing, I guess, some other people's poems. He's not impressed with them. I guess that's what he's saying. Or they don't treat him or her like a muse, whatever that means. But there's one other thing that he's saying that's very concrete. What he's saying is, you have more than one poet that you support, right? In others' work, you correct the verse. But for me, you are my muse. So there's at least 2 people that he's talking about, himself and some other poet.
Right.
So now we can take the category of viable poets, and we can determine which of those poets. And I guess, the only way to do this, and it's a somewhat subjective point, but I have identified about 15 poets that I think, and, it includes Ben Jonson, and it includes Webster, and it includes Harrington, Shakespeare, Nash, Spencer, and some others. And the first question I have to ask is, okay, which of these people had relationships with a patron who had relationships with other poets? Because that would match that description. But if he's got an exclusive with anybody, I'm going to consider him, I'm going to put him to the side. I'm going to say, you know what? You missed the cut on this one. Now,
Right.
I might have to come back to that guy later on, and I might have to reevaluate that later on. I'm only making
Right.
an initial cut here, but I'm saying where I can find a poet who more or less, I mean, he's got himself hooked up with somebody who didn't do a lot of patronage or isn't very
Mhm.
well known for being a patron of other people, or didn't have things dedicated to him on a regular basis, but was a personal friend of this particular poet. In that case, and if that's the only person that he's associated with in the main, then I would tend to eliminate that person from my consideration, from further consideration. Would you think that's a reasonable way to go?
I mean, look, you know, I mean, as I say, theories are great, and as long as the evidence leads you there, but it has to be fairly, for me, it has to be fairly strong, conclusive evidence. So now you're going on, you're going on, certain suggestions from the poems, and that's great. I think that's valuable. If you can read a line and say, well, we can connect it to this or that, event, that's great. That is important, actually. Because that's partly how we do this kind of work nowadays. So I'll give you an example, a concrete example. There is the reference in Romeo and Juliet of, why we can date the play to 1595, because there's a reference to the earthquake in 1584. Right? It was been 11 years, right? Since, so, well, okay, that's really good evidence, right?
Which earthquake are we talking about now?
Well, 1584, it shook London.
It was not in London. The earthquake that they are talking about, that they are trying to claim, is the earthquake that is referenced in Romeo and Juliet. The earthquake that they claim allows them to date it in 1595 was an earthquake that took place in Switzerland.
Okay.
In Switzerland. It's currently, according to NASA, and how they do this, I cannot say, because after all, we're looking at something 400 years ago and there was no measuring tools for it. But based on the evidence of the reports of all earthquakes, and what the damage was, the estimate for that earthquake is a 5.4 in Basel, Switzerland, and it was felt. But there is another earthquake.
Okay.
There is another earthquake which these self-same scholars, for some reason, they just refuse to address it. For some reason, they just fail to take it into account. And this earthquake was also a 4.5 or 5.4.
Yeah.
And there are many people who noticed this one because it occurred in Dover.
Okay.
In Dover in 1580. And of course, Dover is hard by Canterbury. And you could then date, of the 11 years that the nurse speaks of, you could then date Romeo and Juliet to 1591.
Right.
Which makes a lot more sense to me than the 1595 earthquake in Basel, Switzerland, being so significant that an audience in London would know what the heck you were talking about. Whereas an audience in London would most certainly recall the earthquake in Dover. And if they knew of the earthquake in Dover and you were playing this thing in 1595 and hadn't adjusted your number so that it said 16 years ago,
right,
and instead you continue to use the number 11 years ago, people in the audience would go, no, it was in 1580. I remember because the whole wall in my house collapsed.
Yeah, so I hadn't heard either earthquake theory, but
well, I would suggest you go to the NASA website and you look up earthquakes in the 1500s. In the 16th
I will do
century.
that. But now, okay, so my point though is that whether this earthquake or not, is that's the kind of evidence we need to seek.
And that's the kind of evidence I'm trying to get to. And what I'm saying here is it's a process of elimination,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
We take likely suspects or potential suspects or, the usual suspects as they did in the movie. And you line them up and you judge them by the characteristics and whether or not they match the eyewitness testimony. And in this case, the eyewitness testimony is telling us that the poet in question had a patron who also patronized other poets.
Right.
Now, with that evidence, I am able, out of a list of 15, and these are published poets, we're not talking about the man in the moon here. We're talking about people who were recognized poets that did things that we can actually know of. And of these 15 or 16 people, all of whom have been suggested by other scholars.
Right.
I mean, I'm open to anybody making any other suggestions, bring them in. We'll weigh them the same way. We'll treat them the same based on the testimony that I have in my hands. I can eliminate 5 of the 15 right away. Right away. And so, I feel like I'm making progress. I haven't found my actual person yet, but I've, narrowed it a little bit.
Yeah.
And now I come to the next statement. And the next statement has to do with, the full proud sail of his great verse.
Right.
And he goes on to compare his verse to a little boat. That's what the author of the sonnet does. Well, okay. Now, again, I'm open to interpretation here, and I'm willing to spread a very wide net because I don't want to kick somebody out because I misunderstand what I'm reading.
Right.
Because the first thing that occurs to me when I read that is, we're talking about ships and sailing. The full proud sail gives me an instantaneous imagery of a boat on the water with a sail.
Right.
It's hard to avoid. It's mentioned. But it's also possible that it's metaphorical, and the full proud sail could be, I don't know, a windmill, or it could be, it could just be anything. It could just be the wind. It could be a lot of things. But I think, you have to ask yourself, all right, what can I do with this evidence? Can I ask myself the question, is it a valid question to ask? How many poets of the remaining group of 10 or 11 published anything or posthumously had published anything having to do with voyages or journeys or boats or, some sort of epic adventure, something like that, as compared to a little boat?
Yeah.
I know, for instance, that George Chapman translated the Iliad. That would seem to fulfill that description. I don't know if you disagree, but that would seem to me to fulfill the description. There are about half a dozen others who wrote some kind of, Samuel Daniel, for instance, he wrote the Civil Wars.
Right.
Now, I don't think the Civil Wars took place principally on water, unlike the Iliad. But, it's conceivable that boats were involved somewhere along the way. And so I'm not going to say Samuel Daniel is no longer a candidate, even though a civil war, all the civil wars except that the Iliad was a civil war of its own kind, and so was the Peloponnesian War, and it fought major ocean battles, sea battles. So, so I'll leave Daniel alone for now. But I can sure as heck throw out Amelia Bassano, who wrote feminist work, not about seafaring or anything. I could put her aside.
Right.
I don't have to worry about her. And there are other people that I can put aside. Now, that's my working process. Okay. So now I've taken the 15 and I've winnowed it down to about 8 with 2 statements. All right. I mean, do you follow me, or you?
Yeah, I understand. I guess with respect to the sailing metaphor, I mean, it's a seafaring nation, England, and they had gone through. Many of them would have witnessed, if they hadn't sailed, they would have witnessed, the Armada, for example.
Of
So
course.
so so in other words, it would be pretty hard to eliminate people who may not have written directly on sailing, but they could have witnessed it, or they may not have sailed, but they would have witnessed sailing. So you have seafaring references to many, many plays and poems.
I agree. I
you know,
agree.
So
But they actually have to be there. I mean, if somebody is writing, for instance, I'm not saying Ben Jonson, but I'm saying Ben Jonson wrote city comedies.
yeah,
If you are generally known for writing city comedies, I'm not going to look at those particular pieces of work and think that I'm going to find much about sailing in them. I might.
sure.
I think more likely, if somebody is complaining and characterizing this person as having written something epic about sailing, I wouldn't look to Ben Jonson first.
I'm just thinking, for example, of The Merchant of Venice. References to argosies and what have you are plentiful.
Well, I absolutely, and Shakespeare is still on my list. Absolutely, yeah. Shakespeare could be a rival. Absolutely. Yeah. But I certainly am looking more closely at the 8 people that remain. I am really zeroing in on them. And now I come to my next one. And my next one is interesting. It's the one about the hymns. Mm-hmm. It's the one where he say, I cry Ave to every hymn that he writes.
Right.
Well, okay. Now, this implies, and in the loosest sense of the term, this implies a song. Okay, well, Shakespeare's plays are full of songs, so, you can't, so we're still dragging Shakespeare along. He's his own rival, I suppose. I don't know. But he's in there. He wrote songs, so leave him alone. Leave my guy alone, right? Mm-hmm. But hymns is a very specific kind of song. And if I had somebody who wrote a poem who said it was a hymn, that would be more close to the description that's being given to me, because he doesn't say, I sing with joy every song that he ever wrote. He says, I cry Ave to every hymn that he wrote.
Okay.
Hymns are specific. Do I have people who have specifically written poetry that they have put the name hymn on top of it? And I do.
Mm-hmm.
Spenser.
Okay.
Right? 4 hymns. He published that. Chapman again. Why won't this guy go away? He's a lunkhead. I don't like his poetry, but he's there. But there he is. He published Hymn of Cynthia and Hymn of Night. It was his first publication. And then he turned around and he wrote this thing about Ovid, where he has the Song of Corinna. And then he wrote this thing about Drake going to Guyana, which is called the Song of Guyana, right? So Chapman is very busy matching up with all of the descriptions.
Right.
Now we're getting into a narrower territory. I would say at this point, I've got about 6 writers that I can really, really associate with that, plus the other 2 that preceded it. Now that's out of the 15, I've narrowed it down.
Okay.
Are you with me?
Yeah.
I mean, you're following it anyway.
Yeah. No, I'm not. I certainly have not come to your conclusion. That's for sure.
In this case, my operating theory is we are going to allow the sonnets to speak for themselves.
Right.
And we are not. If the sonnets wanted to tell me who wrote them, and I think they do.
Okay.
But they are going to have to tell me. I'm not going to accept any kind of input from an editor who may or may not be an honest representative of the work.
Right.
And where they may be, fine, that's fine, if the sonnets support that. If the sonnets do not, within the four corners of the document
Mhm.
and what it is addressing, I am going to try to determine what they say. Now, the
Okay.
argument as to a name that got attached to that later, and it could have been 5 minutes later, or it could have been 10 years later,
Right.
that is a separate question.
Okay. Well, let's pick up with that next time, and then send me the information. I'll, we can follow
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
Okay.
I'll send you the transcript of this and anything
Okay.
else that I think is useful. You probably won't have time to read it, but you'll have it. And
You
I'll
never know.
reschedule for next week,
Okay.
same time, same bat channel.
Always
and
nice
see
to
how it
chat
goes.
with you, Peter.
Well, Carol, I thought that was a very interesting opening conversation. And first of all, I want to thank Professor Khoury for joining us for this investigation of the Rival Poet Sonnets. I think you raised a lot of very important points, but I'm very curious now about Peter's methodology. He says he's trying to read the sonnets literally for evidence. Do you think that's a good method that works?
Well, yes and no. It's often a very tricky line to draw because it is apparent, even with writers of fiction, that they do use their own experiences and they do write about their own experiences, but it would be wrong to try and interpret everything someone writes as being literally true and autobiographical, because that isn't necessarily the case. And I think our Oxfordian friends fall into that trap, especially with Hamlet, trying to interpret it as a slightly disguised autobiography. And when you come to poetry, it becomes even more tricky because, as Joseph quite rightly says, poetry is very frequently, it's about metaphor, it's about looking at things from a very askance angle. It's about looking at how things might symbolize other things. And so you have to be very careful when you do say, but this is true. However, I do think it is possible, simply by reading something, to discern that somebody is talking about something that is based on reality, that is based on something that has actually happened in their life. After all, if you listen to the lyrics of any popular music of the last 50 years, you will have a mixture of songs which are just songs and songs which very much reflect the writer's own experiences, their unhappy love life, their political battles, and in the case of several infamous rock songs, how much they absolutely hate their manager. So people who write poetry, who write lyrics, do use them to express themselves, and they do use them to reflect and reflect upon their actual life. So I think as well as a rather subjective interpretation, does this sound like a real experience? You can also say, well, if this does sound like a real experience, is there something that I can find in the historical record that, without twisting and hammering and punching into shape, does seem to fit this situation? Now, if the situation is a very common one, my best friend stole my girl, well, you're not going to get very far with that because that has happened to human beings in the past 500 years. But if it's something very specific, and in this case, it is something very specific, I'm talking about a poet who writes about ships and the sea. I'm talking about a poet who refers to his work as a hymn. Then you're talking much more specifically And although there might well be more than one fit to it, it won't fit everybody. For example, you could very well say, oh, Spenser. Spenser referred to his work as a hymn. Therefore, it could be Spenser. But then if we look at the works of Spenser, how many nautical references do we find? Pretty much none. So perhaps it isn't Spenser, because in order for it to fit a real person, we would need both those things to match. And the person we find that in is, of course, George Chapman.
Okay, well, now let me ask the second half of my question. Do you think that Peter is correct in focusing his attention on these 9 sonnets in particular? Or should he try to incorporate information from the entire collection of Shakespeare's sonnets? I mean, where do you come down on the side of that?
Well, the first thing I'd say is we're referring to them as the Rival Poet Sonnets. And this isn't a term that we've coined. It isn't a term that's exclusive to people who discuss the Shakespeare authorship question. It's a term that goes back to at least the late 19th, early 20th century. And attempting to, quote, identify the rival poet has been a literary game that people have been playing, again, for well over 100 years. So there is obviously something that makes people recognize that this is a group of sonnets that are thematically linked and that can be treated as a subunit of the entire collection of sonnets. Obviously, they're not disconnected from them. They're not an isolated system. They're not an isolated group, but they are definitely a subgroup. They definitely have an identity. Therefore, I think it is completely legitimate to treat them pretty well as a self-contained group without making continual references to the other 145 sonnets.
Aha. But do you think again, and I'm curious here again, can you think of any other sonnets that mention any other poets?
A poet? No, I don't think so. You mean in the Shakespeare sonnets?
Yes, exactly. In the Shakespeare sonnets, in the entire collection, other than the 9 sonnets in question, which we now call the Rival Poet Sonnets. By the way, I don't think this is a word that is actually used in those sonnets. And it's not a title that's given to this particular individual, whoever he or she is. But is there any mention of any third person in any one of those other sonnets?
Open source Shakespeare, such a useful resource. It's 40. Take all my loves, my love, yea, take them all. What hast thou more than thou hadst before? It's 40.
Right. And yet, on sonnet number 42, thou hast her, it is not all my grief, and yet it may be said, I loved her dearly. I don't know about you, but in my mind, that mentions somebody else in the middle of a conversation between Shakespeare and the person to whom he's writing. But what you don't have, to my knowledge, is the mention of another poet.
No, I mean that's my previous example of the friend who stole my car.
Right. So that would be another reason why you could limit this. Not just the fact that other people have designated this the rival poet sequence, but if you really do take the time to go through all those other sonnets, there really is not any mention of any person of this type except in those 9 sonnets.
Yes, and I do think it's important to reiterate that it is a generally accepted designation. Very few people who have studied the sonnets would object to it. I think possibly a few would, but not many. It is something that people, on the whole, agree that these are a discrete group. These are a discernible subset.
All right. Well, that settles that. Peter has now given us 3 pieces of evidence, or eyewitness statements as he calls them, and by process of elimination, he claims to have reduced the number of possible rivals from about 20 known poets in the period to perhaps half a dozen. Now he's promising to reduce that number further and may even declare that he is a likely suspect, someone who matches all of these witness statements. And time will tell whether Professor Khoury will accept them. But I think it's a wonderful starting point that gives us grist for the proverbial mill of the next episode, where Peter and Professor Khoury try to establish whether there is more evidence identifying the rival poet with any kind of clarity. Well, to all you listeners, thank you for staying with us thus far. Join Carol and I for the next episode to find out if we can make further progress in Hidden in Plain Sight.
Hidden in